Title-nya apa? Boleh on Facebook?
Ya, ya.
Ya?
Oh,
Oke.
go.
Biar live.
Ya, live.
Start. Live on Facebook. It's gonna be like slightly delayed for like 15.
And this sound.
Sounds?
So you connect it to the microphone.
No, the sounds is in here. It's like the mixer is very far away. But basically they can get on the okay.
When Yogi performs, you're not connected to his sound.
Directly.
Yeah. I thought you were going to connect
Which
to
were
their
not the plan, but came up connected. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Right. We cut the audio for now. We leave in a corner.
Thank you. So it's cut?
No, cut. I mean the visuals, but no.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be starting the event shortly, so if you do please take your seats. Thank you.
Nando from Sulu Island. don't stop Dengarlah suatu kisah pada zaman dahulu kala, tenggelam suatu desa, begitulah dituturkan. Jika gempanya kuat, disusul air yang surut, segera cari dataran tinggi agar selamat. Itulah smog namanya, sejarah nenek moyang kita. Ingatlah ini semua, pesan dan nasihatnya. Tsunami itu air mandimu, gempa ayunanmu, petir dendang-dendangmu, halilintar lampu-lampumu.
Well, that remarkable piece of music was performed by Mr. Yopi Andri. Thank you so much, Mr. Andri. This is a traditional form of Indonesian music known as nandong from the island of Sulu. And Mr. Andri is also a composer of modern music and director of the cultural arts organization Komunitas Alara Sulu. Thank you so much, Mr. Andri. And what better way to start this event today, which is on the topic of addressing loss and damage, supporting the most vulnerable, lessons from disaster risk reduction and climate change action. So over the next 90 minutes, we'll be hearing from a number of distinguished speakers. My name is Michelle Yonetani. I work with the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. And I'm here also as a member of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, who have led the organization of this event today. Very much a multi-stakeholder event with a huge range of partners from government, from civil society, academia, and so on. So I think there's a slide. Well, there's a slide coming which is covered in logos, and those logos are basically to show you this huge range of organizations and partners who've been involved in putting this event together. Too many to mention. Again, led by the Platform on Disaster Displacement and with the support of governments from its steering group, including Australia, Bangladesh, Germany, Fiji, Mexico, Norway, and the Philippines. So our objectives here today at this really key moment for global policy is hoping that this event will really inform all of our engagement at the global platform and beyond. So bridging the discussions between disaster risk reduction and climate action. And for many of us, not only being here in the global platform, but also involved in preparations towards COP27, climate change towards the end of the year. And our focus today in particular is on the progress needed on efforts to avert, minimize and address loss and damage. And this language of loss and damage takes on different meanings under the different policy streams, if you will. But I think at the end of the day, what we're all focused on here very much is on the communities who are being impacted already severely in disaster situations and under the growing impacts of climate change. So perhaps it's also important to note, as part of this conference, that this event is happening in complement to other sessions here, also focusing on the need to integrate climate action and disaster risk reduction. So for example, right now in parallel to this session, there is one on climate risk governance going on. And on Friday, on the 27th, there will also be a special event, which will be considering disaster risk reduction, the global goal for adaptation. And what's, I think, very special about this event is what we're trying to do is to bridge some of the different perspectives coming from different fields and approaches that can help to inform progress on these issues, both from academia and science, from the arts, and from activists. And so we were going to be asking our panelists today to share local experiences from different regions of the world, putting communities at the center. So to help us set the scene with some welcoming remarks, I'd first like to invite two distinguished speakers helping to frame our discussions today. First, from the government of Fiji will be Permanent Secretary David Kolitagane from the Ministry for Maritime and Rural Development and Disaster Management. And then from the UNFCCC Climate Change Secretariat, Mr. Youssef Nasser, who is the Director of the Adaptation Divisions. But first of all, Permanent Secretary, I'd like to invite you to the podium, please.
Excellencies, delegate, moderator, good evening, and very good warm afternoon to you. I'm indeed honored to be here today to be part of this informal discussion, replacing loss and damages using DRR as a climate action axis. Firstly, let me thank the organizers bring us here in Bali post-COVID. It's a new experience for many of us. We would like to thank all those who are involved in background discussions, linking up those who are linking up online, those who are filming in person. Ladies and gentlemen, Pacific is now more than ever facing the impact of climate change and disaster at an unprecedented level. Disaster displacement has been one of these urgent issues that are Pacific seas are now left to grapple with. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, IDMC year 2020 alone, weather-related events such as floods, storms, drought, and are responsible for 98% of disaster displacements. Given that we are at the forefront of climate change battle, we have witnessed an increase in displacement over the past couple of years as a result of frequent tropical cyclones coupled with strong winds and widespread flooding. Ladies and gentlemen, over 25 million annually. It's a huge number. 25 to 30 times the size of the population of Fiji. We therefore call for action and support of 26 to avert, minimize and address displacement and other forms of loss and damage associated with adverse effect of climate change. And it's discussed in today's session. The Fijian government has undertaken a significant work to develop responsive laws and policies at the national level. For example, as part of our efforts to implement national measures to support our communities to adapt to climate change, we prepare and to develop readiness as a consequence to address loss and damage. Fiji has developed our national plan relocation guidelines and disaster displacement guidelines. We set out important principles to protecting and assisting communities affected by displacements. Offers practical guidance and step-by-step procedures to guide our village and communities in any plan relocation. So the impact is already at home. We are already responding. We now know that climate displacement is a more complex issue. And unfortunately, I think that the discussions that happen more frequently doesn't dive deeper into the issues and the problems, the real problems that communities go through during any displacement process. It's a very complex issue. Why? Because young women and children are involved across community profile that are affected, that are moved. Some displacements happen for within 5 days during, for example, in setting up the evacuation centers. Some move permanently from their original land to where they are going to be displaced. Loss of social and cultural background, loss of land and productive food security becomes an issue. And some stay without food for a number of days in the national displacement process. Therefore, I feel that government cannot address this alone. And we are happy with the support of development partners. Very grateful that today's event says some light and will bring out some actionable items and recommendations that the community, our community as a whole, can discuss and finalize moving forward. In Fiji, there's more than 40 communities that must be urgently relocated due to encroaching sea levels. As I mentioned, we've taken steps to integrate DRR and TCA by tasking our National Disaster Management Office in the responsibility of implementing climate-induced community relocations. Using this approach, we have successfully relocated about 6 communities at a cost of nearly $4 million of Fijian government. As the current chair of the platform with the disaster displacement, and we're about to hand over to the European Union on 1st July 2022. We welcome discussions on this disaster placement, loss and damage, and to discuss this issue, such an important global event as the global platform for DRR and Bali. The PDD will continue to work with all of us to ensure that the next round of discussions on loss and damage at COP27 and under the UN have to proceed process integrate DRR and human mobility and challenges and perspectives and the considerations. Specifically, we must thank IDMC, OIM, UN, and the Norwegian agencies who are already investing in some form of project and support in the Pacific Islands. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to the discussions that we will share this afternoon, and during the expert panels will be sharing their views on these important issues. And I hope that the considerations of issues from smaller Pacific states also continue. Thank you.
Very much, Permanent Secretary, for bringing this perspective from the small island developing states and highlighting for us this complexity of issues related to displacement as a form of loss and damage, including in relation to social, cultural issues of land, food security. Indeed, you've highlighted so well the complexity that communities are already facing and that governments are also challenged to address through policy. And I'd like to mention that Fiji indeed is leading the way in this area in relation to displacement with your groundbreaking work on planned relocation, guidelines on internal displacement and so on. So thank you very much for your remarks. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Nassef from the UNFCCC Secretariat to please join us.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, PDD. Thank you, Sarah, for organizing this. And welcome to this very important event. The impact is already home and we are now responding. That was a very sobering entry point from His Excellency, Mr. Kolitagani, the Permanent Secretary from Fiji. And for some of us, planned relocation or forced displacement are potential expectations. I think for others, especially in the small islands, it is today's reality. Now, when typically you bring a UN bureaucrat to speak at a gathering like this, you'd expect me to say that the IPC predicts millions of people will get displaced due to impacts like sea level rise, floods, droughts, etc. I think that would be preaching to the converted. And there will be far more eloquent people who will bring these details. So I'd rather like to address another issue, which is the shift in mindset that is necessary to deal with climate change as an existential threat. And how should this change our outlook towards something like displacement or other factors that we deal with? And we have a significant work stream under the UNFCCC, which is the loss and damage work stream, which I also allude to, where the thinking is going on trying to make sense of this transformation. So I typically look at the evolution of climate change and perhaps other ecological concerns as having moved through three distinct phases. The beginning, we were dealing with this as an environmental issue, and the actors were limited to environment people, meteorologists, and the responses were siloed within a very specific set of activities. Then we moved into the developmental phase, and perhaps we're at the tail end of this, where we had the MDGs, we started talking about ecosystem services, so quantifying the value of nature, trying to make the business case for doing the climate action, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. Then we got the Paris Agreement, and a couple of years later, we got a seminal report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on warming of 1.5 degrees, followed by another report the following year from IPBES, Intergovernmental Panel for Ecosystem Services under the Biodiversity Convention, and both said that we're now facing an existential phase. It's no longer environmental, no longer developmental, it's now existential. how do you catch up with this? How do you transform economics to include human existence as a variable? Quantify that? How do you quantify the existence of a country versus non-existence? And this is the evolution of the mindset we're talking about. We're talking about the existence of whole countries is at stake. So displacement here is not just about some people looking for another place and then coming back, because the country might not be physically there. And the implications on thinking about international law. For decades, we've defined the country as being people, government, and territory. What if you have people and government and no territory? Does the country cease to exist? This is the new thinking on relocation that I'm trying to sort of bring to your attention, where it goes a bit beyond our traditional tools and mindset. We face the extinction of whole species, including our own. How do you factor this into cost-benefit analysis or typical policies? And so this is the new dimension within which one thinks of relocation, whether planned or forced, or environmental refugees, the whole existence of countries. We know Kiribati has been looking for options to move people. What happens to the exclusive economic zone? What about if a country disappears and then comes back again after we've hopefully solved the climate crisis? There's so much there to think about. Now, within our process, now moving to a more operational level, we had been thinking of adaptation, and many of you know that in the early days, late 80s, early 90s, adaptation was seen as a defeatist approach to climate action and a way to sort of circumvent the need for actually mitigating. Eventually, and I think this happened around the fourth assessment report of the IPC, there was a clear message that we are seeing already observed impacts due to climate change, and so adaptation is absolutely necessary. Even if we reduce emissions tomorrow to zero, it's still necessary. And then it became clear that we need that complement beyond adaptation, whether it's due to a failure of mitigation or adaptation, or due to the fact that one never reduces risk to zero. There is also a need to look at post-impact needs, which is what we call loss and damage. And so things like planned relocation, things like forecast-based finance, all the types of actions that need to be addressed following the emergence of losses or damages are sort of a new area of thinking for the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC process provides support for preemptive, planned, anticipatory adaptation. The part of supporting countries after a loss materializes is not yet part of our process, but it's working. And the Glasgow conference of 26 created a tremendous step forward on this by operationalizing what's known as the Santiago network in order to provide technical support for countries to make sense of these needs post-impact, and also for initiating the Glasgow dialogue, which is a conversation that will take place over this year and next year on how funding for loss and damage would be affected. And I welcome very much the representative of the UK presidency here, who's been with us throughout this whole effort through Glasgow and still today in trying to move this forward. So this is being taken up by something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage, which is the overarching sort of mix of expertise, people from development, people from the humanitarian community, from disaster risk reduction, from mobility, that are involved in this holistic thinking of how to respond to these types of things in the future. And it includes several expert groups under it. One is the Task Force on Displacement, which is also a multi-stakeholder group coming up with this type of new thinking. And this is the thing that we have to emphasize here. It's not about people coming with just the past as a guide for the future. We know that the future is very different. Like the examples we just gave you, we have to reinvent international law, we have to reinvent economics. And so the thinking here has to be one of co-creation. And I'm hoping that in this event, we'll manage to come up with these creative ideas as we move forward. Within the loss and damage mechanism, we also have a group looking at non-economic losses, and that's where we start looking at things that are not easily quantifiable, including culture, including species loss, to nature. We have a group called looking at slow onset events. So it's not just rapid onset extreme events. We have a group looking at comprehensive risk management and a group looking at support. So all of these create that huge mosaic of collective intelligence that is helping the process to advance the thinking into the future, into that new existential mode, where the past is no longer a guide or a predictor for how to anticipate the future. And I think we're already getting the guide of what to expect and how to think about it from countries like Fiji, who sort of are at the forefront of climate impacts and already dealing with it. And so there's a tremendous group of lessons to learn here. So thank you very much, Excellency, for helping us understand a bit more what's happening in your country. And of course, this is shared with many other small island developing states, some of which are also least developed countries. And so I just wanted to give sort of an overarching introduction of how what's keeping me awake at night when I think of these things. Knowing that even focusing on displacement, it means different things to different communities. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There are capacities, differences in capacities. There are differences in objectives, differences in exposure, differences in opportunities for response. And so hopefully we can at least scratch the surface of some of these complex issues here in this group. And I know you have a wonderful lineup of speakers. I see Harjeet there. We were together in the loss and damage discussion recently with the philanthropy. So I know there'll be very good insights from him and from the other speakers. And with this, I wish you a great event. And thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nasser, for taking us on this potted history in the evolution of the policy dialogue over the years, to this point where we are indeed talking about an existential threat to vulnerable communities. And as you put it, the need for this co-creation, some of these innovative approaches to really see how we can move forward. I would now like to invite our 4 panelists to also join me up here on the podium. And I'd like to invite the Permanent Secretary. I believe you can stay with us for the entire event. Thank you so much. If you'd like to join me here. And for our technical support at the back, we're going to now show you a video, a pre-recorded video. And this is going to move us into thinking also, bringing into our discussion what the actual science, what the academics, what the scientists are actually telling us now. So this recording has been provided kindly by Dr. Martin van Ast, who is one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's lead authors, and also director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center.
Climate and Disaster Resilience at the University of Twente. I was also a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 report on impacts and adaptation. And I'll be sharing some of the main conclusions of that report relevant to your discussions on loss and damage today. Let me share my screen. Of course, I can't be doing justice to all the details in that report, which as a whole is a very thick volume, and it's based on 34,000 academic publications. Final summary for policymakers was signed off by all world governments. So what we're looking at here is really the consensus. And I'll take you through some of the conclusions most relevant to your discussions on loss and damage today. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to contact me. First key message is that climate change is no longer an issue of the future. And of course, everyone is feeling that around them, but we're also seeing it very clearly documented in the scientific evidence. First of all, the impacts are already dangerous and widespread, not only in nature, but also for billions of people, despite efforts to adapt. Our estimates are that between 3.3 and 3.6 billion people already live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change today. That was underlined actually since the report came out by a number of terrible disasters where we could really point the blame on climate change in terms of the increased risk of these events happening. And that includes, for instance, the terrible floods in Durban, as well as the record-breaking heat wave in India and Pakistan, which we calculated was over 30 times more likely due to climate change. And if you want to know more of those detailed studies, look at worldweatherattribution.org. The basis of those sorts of studies is what allows us in the IPCC report to conclude that climate change is already having such an impact. But it's not just the changes in the climate hazards, it's the combination of those hazards with high vulnerability. And those risks are thus also shaped by other trends, including poverty and inequality, unsustainable use of natural resources, and urbanization, where many people are concentrated in high-risk areas. As a result of those combinations, climate change is already contributing to humanitarian crises, where climate hazards interact with high vulnerability. And that particularly also includes the impact of climate and weather extremes that are increasingly driving displacement in all regions, with a particular concern about small island states. Of course, all of this is relevant to your discussions on loss and damage. But it's important to highlight again that these are compound effects. What we saw with the India and Pakistan heat aggravating food insecurity, for instance, also in East Africa. That is a combination of floods and locust infestations a few years ago, the current drought, but of course also the impacts of COVID, leaving so many people so much poorer, the conflicts in the region, but also the conflict in the Ukraine putting stress on global food supplies. And now the India and Pakistan heat wave further hampering global wheat supplies, for instance. So that sort of cascading and complexity of risks is increasingly important, and climate change is just making that worse. In some cases, our responses themselves are driving further risks. Now, all that picture of complexity is also leading us to concern that risks are worse than we thought before, and every increase in warming increases further risks, future risks. This is unavoidable. It's the present, but it's also an unavoidable increase in risks in the future. Now, we can adapt, and there are many actions we can take and are taking to reducing the risks, but action on adaptation has increased, but the progress has been uneven. We're not adapting fast enough. There are many cross-cutting solutions, which include better disaster risk management, better early warning systems, climate services, risk spreading and sharing. Many of the solutions also discussed this week at the global platform. But the report is also very clear that there are limits to adaptation, and we're meeting some of those limits today. And also in the future, it's clear that even the most effective adaptation will not prevent all losses and damages. This is going to get further out of hand as warming continues, especially above 1.5 or even 2 degrees. But today we are already facing limits to adaptation, often shaped also by financial constraints. And those financial constraints relate to the global financial flows, where we're seeing too little climate finance flow to the most vulnerable countries, but also too much of it focused only on greenhouse gas mitigation, not on adaptation or dealing with those impacts. And one of the concerns the report highlights is that the current impacts are shaping future vulnerability. So the risks of the impacts of today are shaping the risks of the future. And that's also where some regions may be sliding down unless we find the right mechanisms, including the right financing, to help them cope with impacts today. And of course, that impact is primarily on the most vulnerable regions, but also the most vulnerable people in those regions, including those at particular risk of displacement or already displaced. So I think you've got your work cut out for this session. The IPCC is very clear. These are our concerns today. We are facing hardly the suboptimal future where we need to think about how we manage impacts rather than just prevent everything that's coming our way, by aggressive mitigation of greenhouse gases, by effective adaptation, but also by solutions to the losses and damages that cannot be avoided. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good discussion.
So thank you once again to Dr. Martin van Ast and to the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So we've heard from already an incredible diversity of perspectives this afternoon, starting with Mr. Andre, reminding us of the power of traditional knowledge, the way that art can also play an incredibly important role in saving lives. We heard from Permanent Secretary from Fiji about how countries on the front lines of these impacts already, the most vulnerable communities, working with their governments, are already taking action. And of course, the role of the UN system and the UNFCCC in helping to facilitate all of these solutions. So now turning to another 4 perspectives from our panelists here, I would like to start at the end of the panel on my left here, on your right, Tiziana Bonzon, who is the Manager on Climate, Migration and Resilience at the International Federation of the Red Red Crescent societies. And just to start off the discussion, Tiziana, I'd like to ask you, first of all, to talk to us a little bit about how the IFRC's work is relevant indeed on this topic, and how you're already seeing loss and damage occurring in your everyday work.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, first of all, to the for the opportunity to express some reflections on behalf of Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies and the IFRC as a whole. I'm very pleased, actually, to come immediately after Martin, who is so well set the scene in terms of what we're seeing, and in a nutshell, confirming that the climate crisis that we are all experiencing is, in fact, a humanitarian crisis, and something that we've been experiencing already over several years, and now science is indeed confirming what Martin has just shared with us. We know that people's lives are negatively impacted by this increasing frequency and intensity of climate-related and weather-related disasters. People are experiencing destruction, trauma, resource scarcity, and they're really impacting on their physical and mental well-being. In 2020, the IFRC released the IFRC World Disaster Report that focused on the climate crisis. The title is quite interesting, actually. It's calm heat or high water. So we can see immediately the two major risks that we are confronted with in many contexts: heat waves, flooding, cyclones, typhoons. And what came out of this report is that we have seen, first of all, an increase in disasters that are related to climate and weather. Actually, 83% of all disasters we are responding to are caused by climate and weather-related events. There have been rising by almost 35% over the last 3 decades, impacting 1.7 billion people around the world. We also heard from Martin and from the IPCC report that these climate and weather extremes are indeed driving increasing displacement in all regions. The same framework for disaster risk reduction is indeed recognizing that displacement is one of the most immediate impacts of disasters. Most people are forced to move, they actually move within their own countries. And statistics indicate that, especially 2020, I know that the figures have changed for 2021, but in 2020, we were talking about approximately 30.7 million people internally displaced, which is 3 times more than those that have been displaced by conflict environments. So now coming to what the Red Cross does, Red Cross and Red Crescent. Our national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies were present in 192 countries. They work on a daily basis with governments and local communities to identify interventions that are aimed at reducing risks and helping communities to adapt to a changing climate. However, as actually Martin already mentioned, we also see that adaptation efforts and disaster risk reduction action is not sufficient, and many communities have already reached the limits of adaptation. When this happens, well, one of the consequences is that people are often in a situation where they have to find new livelihoods, new homes, new communities. And of course, the impacts are greatest in contexts where the capacity is lower, where systems are already overstretched at a national and a local level. So what to do? As we continue, of course, to learn more about climate migration and displacement, we believe it is crucial to prioritize communities that are most exposed and vulnerable to the impacts of climate and weather-related disasters that are actually exacerbating existing challenges and underlying vulnerabilities, and are forcing communities to cope with compounding risks and crises. The adverse impacts of climate and weather-related disasters that contribute to migration and displacement, they can be, in fact, avoided in many contexts and mitigated through effective disaster risk reduction measures, investing in adaptation and resilience, and scaling up early warning systems. The climate community talks of averting and minimizing loss and damage, but both concepts, they really overlap with adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And for us as humanitarians, this is not a new concept. When we prepare for, we respond to disasters, we help communities to recover, we are already dealing with losses and damages. Our network is, as I mentioned, intervening in 192 countries. And over the past couple of years, despite the COVID pandemic, they were actually able to reach some 139 million people through pandemic-proof disaster risk reduction interventions. And some 140 national societies have been adapting their contingency plans to take into consideration these large-scale disasters that are becoming more frequent, more intense, and due to the climate crisis. So we are considering, of course, investing in innovative approaches, including, of course, anticipatory action, which has been already discussed since the beginning of the platform, because we know that this really helps to minimize the impacts of disasters. And we recognize there are also opportunities associated with utilizing forecast-based financing to support anticipatory humanitarian action also in the context of disaster displacement. Because by using anticipatory action, we can in fact help prevent the negative conditions that push people on to be displaced by disasters. But in some situations, we know that disasters or disaster risks are so severe that in fact they necessitate planned relocation of persons away from their homes. So already heard this term from previous speakers. Planned relocation or managed retreat, which is a different term often used by the DRR community, because it is about moving people and assets away from areas that are becoming uninhabitable, can be in fact a vital way of reducing disaster risk or adapting to climate change. However, and we know this, the experience of communities with planned relocations are predominantly negative. And this is due to a lack of community participation, the selection of inappropriate sites, or the under-budgeting of relocation costs. From our experience, we have a number of contexts where national societies have been involved in state-led or community-led interventions. We have examples in the Philippines, in Myanmar, talking about countries, of course, from Asia Pacific, as we are in this region. In Vietnam, just to give an example, the Vietnam Red Cross, in partnership with Swiss Red Cross, has been part of a program called Living with Floods, where they constructed a whole new village comprising houses, a water supply system, an electricity system, kindergarten, and tree planting. Samoa Red Cross was engaged in supporting populations moving away from coastal areas and providing supply of rainwater harvesting systems. And we're seeing, I'm just finishing. Sri Lanka Red Cross just now is, for instance, engaged in constructing over 1,600 houses to help the tea estate workers to be relocated from areas that have been prone to landslides. So these are just some examples, concrete examples of what we mean in terms of planned relocation that are very concrete. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiziana. That's great. Very concrete examples there. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Kosidi Adesu. And he is the acting regional leader for Africa at the Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Risk Reduction, probably known to many of you more quickly as GNDR. So Adesu, based on your work in West Africa, how are communities there dealing with disaster displacement due to extreme weather events, slow onset events, and how is the civil society organizations and the civil society DRR, call it that, supporting or helping to address these challenges on the ground?
Thank you so much, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry if my presentation seems a bit provocative this minute, but I will try. So it's important, and I hope we all agree that climate change is a natural event, first of all. We are talking about the topic today simply because of the selfishness and greediness of the humankind. And this is the main source of the problem of the earth today. Why are we so worried about climate change? Simply because people are living on a very bad way, the consequences of that movement, that phenomenon. In Niger, for example, where we are working in, actually, we can trace kind of on track, if you want, a very long queue of consequences of climate change. And you remember in 2013, PASO international mechanism was adopted, and in 2019, the Santiago network for loss and damage was put in place, because these are some of the mechanisms that the UNF3 system has found to tackle the issue, to deal with the topic at a certain stage. And this mechanism led to managing the impact of climate change, which we are talking about today, loss and damage. Unfortunately, in my field, I think the concept itself was not well understood at that time, because by definition, we only think about the physical aspect, and I know people have already said it before. We are thinking about the physical aspect of climate change, but I think the definition should go beyond the physical aspect to include the aspect that adaptation has not been capable to manage, which is something I call the residual dimension of climate change. This has not been covered, and this is the main problem, because at least today we can mention amounts dedicated for adaptation, but nothing left for the residual aspects which are not covered by adaptation. And this is where the loss and damage becomes a serious concern that we really need to reflect on. So what is happening in the field? Again, I was talking about Niger. You know, we are talking about drought. We are talking about flood. For coastal countries, we are talking about coastal erosion. We are talking about, yeah, there are a lot of impacts. But beyond those we see as directly related to climate change, there are also indirect impacts. You know, when you go to Zende, for example, in Niger today, you find that the very small space available as pasture is issue of conflicts between different communities. And these conflicts have exacerbated the life of the communities, and most of them felt obliged to flee from those regions. Unfortunately, when they flee from their homes, some don't know even where they are going to. And those who know where they are going to, they don't know where they will stay. And there is no condition to host these people, to support them, to welcome them in their new position. So I think it's important to deal with climate change and loss and damage on several aspects. So we should include dignity of people, their rights, the rights of the communities. I also think I put some note on my solidarity. We need to develop solidarity for these people, but also think about the finance. Generally, and up to now, we don't have money. And to be sincere, we are talking about the dialogue of Glasgow, and I don't trust the dialogue of Glasgow simply because when the negotiation on climate change have started on this earth, the quantity of greenhouse gases that we have emitted are lower than today. So my question, how are we still thinking? How are we working to reduce an impact, and at the same time, we don't have money for impact, but we have money to exacerbate the problem itself? That's a question. That lets me think that this dialogue is another mechanism that we are putting in place, and I believe that let me share with you what I think. The money for the dialogue can help to solve life on the ground. And unless you tell me that the money will help you to double the budget, and I don't want to involve myself in the debate of loss and damage framework or not. But there is something very important that we need to understand, and I hope I have time. All right? Okay, thank you. We need to increase the budget. We need to increase the budget for adaptation. We need to increase the budget and to think about people who are really victims of loss and damage. Because they've not wanted this, they've never somehow contributed or on a very low level contributed to the impact, but they are really living the consequence of the impact. I've seen people move without their birth certificates, and in their host cities, they can't even have access to the social services simply because they don't know where they are from. This is not their fault. So these are some of the points I want to raise as a concern, I want to say climate change, loss and damage is a reality. It's happening in the field, and it's important to understand that. Please, UNFCCC people, go back to the field, see what's happening before continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adesi. Thank you indeed for also raising this this complexity that we're seeing in terms of risk. And this is also being addressed in different sessions across the platform this week, but also in the World Reconstruction Conference and in the discussions on early warning systems. This need for looking at risk in a very integrated way and thinking about the things which are very immediate, like the floods, but also the more indirect impacts that we're seeing in exacerbating conflict, as you were talking about in West Africa. And this dilemma, which I think I've heard humanitarians talking about a great deal, how can we actually reduce these impacts when we don't even have enough resources to deal with the impacts already hitting us every single day? A huge dilemma in terms of resources that are already being stretched to the limit. Okay, now we're going to go back more into the art world again. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Gustav Harriman Iskandar, who's the Managing Director of Common Room. Now, Common Room is a non-profit, open platform for art, culture, and ICT media based in Bandung, Indonesia. And as I've understood it, Gustav, Common Room has a very unique approach to working with indigenous communities in West Java, Indonesia. So could you please share with us how you are combining art with other disciplines such as science and technology to build on traditional knowledge and to develop technical solutions that can reduce disaster displacement risks?
Everyone, especially friends at inviting me to speak in this forum. I will try to share a bit of experience and especially learning experience, how local knowledge, culture and tradition somehow could we can see it as a relevant solutions in order to address some of the complexities and challenges in regards to this disaster displacements. And in the beginning of our talks, we are lucky to directly see the Nando, the traditional storytelling that saved a lot of life in Sulu Islands during the tsunami when it hits Aceh in 2004. And maybe we can start with the slides. Next slides, please. This is actually the work made by Arum Dayu, a female artist. Can you rewind back one slide, please? This is work of Arum Dayu and Yoyo Gasmana called Sawen Lembur. Sawen Lembur is particular rituals in particular indigenous community in West Java, which mainly is a rituals to protect the village and its people. So you can see through the traditional expressions the ideas of protections among community members in traditional community is somehow already exists and embedded into the daily life. Next slide, please. And from this image, we can learn about Pranata Mangsa, the padi culture and traditions of Kasupuan Ciptagelar indigenous community, who have a delicate way how they manage the land in connections with the natural surroundings. Next slides, please. So you can see this Pranata Mangsa is like a farming calendar that somehow the people there can see connections between star clusters, the position of certain star clusters, the microclimate conditions, the dynamics of hydrologies, and so on, including the cycle of insects reproductions, in which, guided by traditional storytelling like a poem, you can read up tanggal kerti turun wesi, tanggal kidang turun kujang, suruh kidang turun kungkang. So it tells you certain positions of star cluster and certain activities in farming traditions all through the year to have good harvest and to avoid a malaise. And next slide, please. So based on the data that we collect from 2008 until 2020, you can see that in 2015 in Indonesia we have experienced a peak of El Nino, where more than 100 1,000 hectares of rice field are failed to be harvested. But in Cittaglar, according to this data, you can see that when they still manage to maintain their culture and traditions in terms of paddy cultivations, the crops productions is double, even though there are effect of El Nino and long drought season. And I think this particular case, you can see that the relationship between local culture, traditions and storytelling with the local knowledge that are somehow relevant to be maintained in order to avoid displacements in the future. So from this, also from the Nandong story, we can see that in many cases, local stories, traditions and culture are somehow still relevant to be looked at as a way to find solutions and avoid displacements in the future. But somehow in many different cases, local knowledge and stories is also often to be neglected. That is why I think the important involve art and culture in this matter is a way to recollect our collective memories, identities, knowledge that can anticipate what will happen in the future. Next slide, please. So as a closing, I will say, share you this traditional Sudanese proverb that basically invite us to revisit the past in order to see the glimpse of our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An incredibly important and data-based reminder of the importance of traditional knowledge in supporting resilience of communities. Thank you so much. So now, last but certainly not least, Mr. Harjeet Singh, who is the Senior Advisor on Climate Impacts at the Climate Action Network International. So Harjeet, I know you've been working across all different levels, local to global and back again. So from your perspective and your experience, how are these multi-level processes and engagement helping us to actually deal with the issues of displacement in relation to disasters? And how can we best assess and address the local realities while also at the same time bringing it to the attention here at the global level?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me here. Just a bit of background. I know you've seen me a lot more in the climate space, but I come from humanitarian community and disaster risk reduction work. And since 2010, I have been urging humanitarian and DRR community to get more involved. This community has been very late in even understanding the implications of what IPCC has been telling us for a very long time. And also now beginning to recognize that the experience that this community brings is so vital in response to losses and damages that we are facing at this moment. And especially in a context when 90% of disasters are climate related, we have to make sure that the humanitarian system is strong enough to respond. And we know it is overstressed and overstretched and has not been able to look at the whole spectrum of climate disasters from extreme weather events to particularly slow onset events. When you talk to humanitarian community, you don't really find a lot of mention of slow onset events like sea level rise and glacial melt and increasing pace of desertification and ocean acidification. We need to do a lot more yet. And also to recognize that the resources that are required to respond to this range of disasters are not there. As per the current estimates, we are looking at resources or damages to the tune of $290 to $580 billion a year by 2030 in developing countries alone. And this is where you still don't have the entire infrastructure built. So the humanitarian system that works much more on the basis of solidarity, we know that has not been sufficiently responding to the crisis because donors are providing money based on geopolitics, based on their own preferences or sometimes whims or fancies. But when we talk about 90% of disasters being climate related or fueled by climate change, you need a more rights-based approach. You need an approach that recognizes the obligation of people who caused the problem in the first place. We need to respond as per the needs and not as per the pockets or preferences of donors. I think that's extremely important. And it's very clear when you look at beyond climate change, you look at response to Ukraine crisis or response to Yemen, it's very clear that it's so much geopolitical. My second point is something, again, I've been saying for a very long time. I think humanitarian and DRR community has to talk about politics much more. 90% of disasters are climate related. We cannot just talk about technical aspects. And when we talk about His Excellency from Fiji very clearly said how people are facing these impacts. Do you think Fiji is responsible for the crisis? And if Fiji is not responsible for the crisis, then it's our moral responsibility to support communities who are facing this crisis. And that cannot happen unless we talk about equity, unless we talk about justice, about human rights. And we are not talking about these terms enough in this humanitarian and disaster risk reduction space. There's a long fight happening around loss and damage finance. And coming from Climate Action Network, yesterday we released a paper, a discussion paper on loss and damage finance facility. We know that it's very contentious, but we need resources. If we don't have resources, people who are losing their homes, their income, their farms, how they are going to be supported? These talks are not going to help. We need concrete resources to flow. And when we talk about displacement, what are we looking at? We're looking at epitome of suffering. People don't lose or leave their homes on, just by choice. We know the kind of displacement, as you very rightly said, His Excellency, that millions are losing their homes and they're being forced out of their homes. It's a matter of injustice, and we have to recognize that, which means, as Vasavi was saying, mitigation has failed. We have not been able to mitigate enough, and we have not provided resources for adaptation, and that's why we are looking at loss and damage. And we have to address that loss and damage now. And again, I want to stress, if we don't talk about politics, no politics, no policy. So it's very important. Third point, we need to look at continuum when we talk about mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And here the theme of GPDRR is risks to resilience. But when we talk about loss and damage, it's the other way around. Many communities who have been resilient because of climate change, they are now moving towards risks. This latest IPCC report put a spotlight on more than 120 risks. Are we able to reduce those risks? How these risks are increasing with rising temperature? We have to talk about it. And again, we don't find enough reference to increasing temperatures in the humanitarian and DRR space. We have to talk about that a lot more. And as I keep saying, this experience that humanitarian community has is so vital to understand what worked in the past, but how the way temperatures are increasing, how we are going to be required to scale up our efforts to respond to the crisis that we are facing. And when we connect the local, national, international, these spaces where we fight for justice, where we talk about loss and damage finance, these are all important. But when it comes to the local level, it's one life, it's one community. Let's not differentiate in terms of actions. We need to have that purposeful distinction of the fights that we are having at the global level, which are important. I'm not saying let's lose those fights, but when we come to the local level, we have to work together as one community. That's where we have to talk about alignment and integration. But somewhere, I'll be very honest, we find that when I come to this space, they're like, oh, climate change, people are talking about it. Can we get a percentage of money from climate change to do humanitarian or to do DRR? That's the discourse I've been listening. And as I said, I come from this community. I can say that with a lot of confidence, that this is what is happening. And that's not the way. We have to look at the entire spectrum and work very comprehensively. And my very last point is connecting to the grassroots work, Michelle, as you said. When we talk about people getting displaced, we are only looking at numbers of people who are getting displaced, as we heard, these are in millions. We are not even able to track how these communities are going back, what kind of support they need, what kind of solutions would be required. Do governments have resources to provide social protection services? No, we don't. And this is where we have to really put a spotlight on what kind of solutions that are needed, where communities have a role to play, and they can come up with their own solutions. We sitting in the boardroom cannot devise solutions for them, but resources are needed. And that's where it connects again to the global aspects. As Nasser said, there's a lot happening at the UNFCCC space. So many avenues for new knowledge have been generated. There are many political processes like global stocktake where we are going to look at whether climate action has been sufficient or not, or developing national level plans, or Santiago network, as Jose was saying. We need to understand how these institutions can play a role in supporting communities while losing their homes. So it's all about now integration and looking at it as a whole spectrum and working across the board and understanding the continuum as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you also, Harjeet, again for challenging us with some new ideas here into the discussion. The need for a rights-based approach, considering needs rather than donor preferences. Bringing more strongly into the DRR space is discussions of equity, justice, human rights. Yes, indeed, challenging us all to think about what we can perhaps learn from the different spaces that we're working in, indeed. I think you're a very good example of someone who's working across them quite effectively. Okay, so shortly now we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. But before I do that, I'd like to invite the ambassador from the UK, Ambassador Ken O'Flaherty, and Norwegian ambassador to Indonesia, Her Excellency Ruud Giveland, to make a short statement.
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all to the hosts and the sponsors. It's been a really interesting and rich discussion. As our COP president has said, we have unapologetically put the concerns of the vulnerable states at the heart of our COP26 presidency. We're very pleased at the progress which has been made on loss and damage under our presidency, despite, of course, there being a lot more to do. But we hope that the creation of the Glasgow Dialogue and the progress on operationalising the Santiago network will lead to real practical progress. And in that regard, I just wanted also to be encouraging all organisations and partners who could have something to contribute to that process to please sign up to the Santiago Dialogue and make sure Santiago network, make sure that we're able to have a deliver genuine practical solutions to build on the points made by Mr. Adesua. I also wanted perhaps to say that I think disaster risk reduction is a good example of the practical action that's already been taken to avert, minimise and address loss and damage. I've heard fantastic examples today of the problems being faced, for example, in Fiji, some of the solutions which have been developed. I think we heard about Vietnam and Sri Lanka, and I think our joint cooperation in this area is essential if we're to make real progress. My question, if I may, for the panel, would be how we bring all that together. I think building a little bit on what you've seen just now. There's a great deal of work underway on adaptation, on disaster risk reduction, humanitarian relief, and that all does contribute to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. But how can we bring the DRR, the climate, the humanitarian communities better together on this agenda more practically to ensure that we are working together as efficiently as possible? We're getting the right expertise to the right place at the right time. I think that will be particularly important in ensuring a successful COP27. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now to the Norwegian Ambassador, Ambassador Giveland.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to just share a few perspectives on behalf of the Norwegian government on this very important topic we're discussing this afternoon. First of all, I also want to thank the panelists for sharing their stories and perspectives that are indeed strong reminders to us all that the world must prepare for more climate-related disasters. And as we know, this is also a clear message in the latest IPCC report and last week's report by the WMO. These disasters will lead to more displacement, and people already displaced are being negatively affected by the consequences of climate change. Nature, ecosystem health, and climate adaptation are closely linked. We must ensure that adaptation solutions, including the relocation of displaced populations, do not impact ecosystems negatively. Instead, we must choose clever relocation and adaptation strategies that can deliver sustainable solutions and contribute to the SDGs. These solutions must also take into account the particular needs of vulnerable populations, people with disabilities, and women and girls. Norway will triple support for climate adaptation and building resilience towards 2026. And support to climate-related migration is part of this effort. We are therefore pleased to co-sponsor this side event. And we are also proud to support a project with PDD in selected pilot countries. This project should deliver important lessons for other countries in the same regions. And we hope these lessons will lead to better support for measures to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of climate change. Now, turning to today's discussion, one question that I was hoping we could discuss is, how can we best ensure coordinated and enhanced global action across climate change and DRR? And this also with reference to the current global context with increased pressure on available funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, before I give a chance to our panelists to respond or react, I'd like to collect another 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Would anybody like to put a question to the panelists? If you could please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Matthew Scott from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. I'm the head of Human Rights and Environment and work primarily on human rights and disaster displacement. So it was encouraging to hear many on the panel talking about the human rights dimension. And I wanted to encourage a bit further reflection about the particular complexity here in relation to loss and damage, thinking about the global dimension and where responsibility lies and how human rights law operates in its current form. And I'm particularly inspired by the comments of Youssef Nassef, encouraging us to think, looking not to the past, but to the future and what international law might look like moving down the line. The problem with human rights in its current form is that it's based on a state sovereignty paradigm. And the countries who have responsibility for the people within their jurisdiction are those authorities who are least responsible for the adverse impacts. So it's not Fiji that's responsible for the adverse impacts of climate change on people within Fiji's jurisdiction. It's the larger global context and countries in the global north. So is there a space within these platforms, the UNFCCC, the GPDRR, and other spaces, where we can begin to have discussions about how to think beyond state sovereignty paradigms around human rights and loss and damage? There's great litigation happening, but I think that's a drop in the ocean. We need these large platforms. So reflections on that most appreciated, and thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Anyone else? Yes, there are 2 ladies here.
Hi, my name is Nabiha Shahab. I'm from Tanahaya.net. It's an on news media.
I'm sorry, could you take the mask down just while you ask the question?
I'm sorry. My name is Nabiha Shahab. I'm from Tanahaya.net. Some of the, you mentioned a lot about how the problem will become more and more worse as it comes, compounding disasters. And I think one of the panelists also mentioned about how we need more budget, need more on adaptation and so on. What I haven't heard maybe a bit about insurance, about prevention. Maybe you can give an insight on insurance. Thank you.
Another person there? Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name's Sophie Rick. I'm the Senior Climate and Resilience Advisor at Action UK, where I also sit on the board of GFDR. Thank you very much for your interventions. And just, I mean, the UK ambassador spoke about how the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage is a potential tool through which the DRR community can get more engaged in the climate space by providing some technical expertise. And I'm just wondering to hear a bit more of your reflections from the panel on other sort of tangible channels that would enable greater integration between the two communities, and particularly as we head towards COP27, what they might be, and your reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just one more. Did I see your hand over there? Yes, at the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Abdullah. I represent GMDR, South Sudan. And we have also been dealing with displacement. And we have people who are displaced. And then when they settle there, they get displaced again. And again displaced, sometimes 3 times. And is there any plan for such kind of conditions for people like that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm going, I know there are a few more hands in the group first. We have little time, I'm afraid. So I'm going to ask you panelists and give you a choice of how you would like to react from your different perspectives to any of the questions. It's quite a range there that have been posed. How to bring it all together, how to ensure coordination, coordinated action, how to better integrate using different channels for that integration, and different tools like insurance or issues around extending the human rights space and the applications of international law. Quite a range there. I'm going to allow you to each take your pick of what you'd like to react to, but please keep your responses really short. And then we're going to, before we wrap up, have another quick fire round and ask you for your key takeaway that you'd like everyone to hear before they leave the room. So first, challenge, please be really strict or you won't have time to wrap up. Tiziana.
Very brief. How we can bring it all together, I think it's an excellent question. Maybe 3 ways, and I'll try to be brief. First of all, an integrated package of actions, anticipatory action, social protection, insurance pools, solidarity funds. We have to bring these actions together and look at them in an integrated way. Let's use disaster law and policy, because this is an entry point to have an integrated approach. So this, you know, it can be extremely effective, but sometimes it's over underexplored. Third point, better connecting global frameworks. I was in New York myself last week, part of the International Migration Review Forum. It was so difficult to make member states recognize that disaster displacement was actually an issue. And so the political will that has actually come up from the other speakers is so important. We need to connect the global platform, IMRF, Sendai, SDGs, so that these things are really coherent. This is the only way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'll try to travel on 2 points. So the question is by Mr. Ken, and the second one is by Mr. Marcus. So for me, let me be concrete. I like the concrete. At national level, we have what we call the direction of civil protection that is managing everything related to TRR. The Ministry of Environment, we have the Department of Climate Change, and we have what we call the National Adaptation Plan. And we know 2 main reports are guiding this topic around climate change. So the IPCC more generally, and now the World Meteorological Organization report. I think that if we succeed at national level to bring all these actors who are working in spirited world and who don't sometimes know each other, if we try to bring them together to work on the ownership of these reports and ask them to plan together, we'll have only one plan that will respond to DRR, climate change. That's my suggestion. Coming to Mr. Marcus, I'm a specialist of international law, so I will try to suggest some path. By nature, law is supposed to solve social problems by nature. And law is supposed to respond to specific problems, to solve specific problems. Therefore, I think it's important to try to join science and law so that law can support science and vice versa. Thank you.
Thanks, Adesu. Over to you, Gustav.
Thank you. I think at the moment we are already live in the age of displacement or dysplasia, so to call. The damage is already done, and it's really hard to find a way to mitigate the situations. But in this important moment, I'm strongly urge institutions and agencies involve art and cultural actors, because I think artists and cultural practitioners is also the one who have this ability to persuade and reshape our imagination and perceptions, not only what we are experiencing today, but also to reshape or to recreate the story for the future. So not only to recollect our collective knowledge and identity, but also try to create a new story that are somehow relevant to see to see our future. Thank you.
We build on some of the previous responses, especially in response to questions from both the ambassadors. I would say we have to stop being territorial. The problem is we say this is humanitarian communities business, this is DRR, this is adaptation. We have to stop that culture. We need to work with the spirit of how I can contribute to the problem that communities are facing. And this is where putting local communities and local actors at the center will actually solve the problem, where we say, you tell us what kind of risks you are facing, increased risk you are facing, and how we can support in terms of knowledge, resources, expertise, analysis, and so on. I think that spirit is extremely important. And at the global level, similarly, how we connect those frameworks, looking at what's already happening and where I can contribute. On the issue of human rights, again, just to add, unless we talk about justice, and we will not be able to relook at the human rights regime, as you very rightly said. And in fact, PDD, the whole thing started with Nansen initiative looking at cross-border, and that is picking up. But again, states have to be far more open. But what we are looking at right now is a world which is much more inward-looking and so much of hostility that we are seeing in many parts of the world, particularly in the rich world. I think we have to first recognize where we stand, and this is the direction that we have to take. Otherwise, we'll be living in a world where we'll be going against what we have achieved so far in terms of international cooperation and solidarity. On insurance, I'm glad you asked this question. Insurance does have a role to play, but unfortunately, as disasters in terms of frequency and intensity increase, extreme weather events and slow onset events, insurance has a very little role to play. On slow onset events where certainty is 100%, insurance doesn't work. And in many cases where extreme weather events are increasing, I'll give you a Dominica example. In 2017, it was hit by Cyclone Maria. Insurance payouts were just 1.5%, and the loss was more than 200% of GDP. So we have to situate insurance where it stands, how little it can now contribute, and it's becoming increasingly less relevant as disasters increase. On Santiago Network, it has its own role. It's about technical assessments, it's about technical support, but we also need to make sure that Santiago Network has resources to provide that technical support. It's not just a secretariat that will do its analysis, but how it can facilitate exchange of technical knowledge.
Thank you, Harjeet. And the final minutes to you, Permanent Secretary.
Thank you, Michelle. I think for small island states, as I mentioned in my opening statement, in regards to the discussions on the investor raise, was the three key messages that we want to see. We have to go back to what the general mentioned and the deputy has mentioned this morning. Some tangible benefits that can be moved to communities. Investing in better early warning systems for communities. of which we are already, as I mentioned, our communities are already relocated. We are already investing in trying to build better infrastructure for housing. But I think with science-based or data-informed, well-informed relocation policies and relocation strategies can really help the villages and government to relocate with a more cost-effective manner. I think we're talking about budget and new item in data. I hope that our development partners can invest more in one systems, for example, especially smaller states that can, because now disaster impact is not only affecting a single country, it affects anyone. So support of the agenda that is now floating in the current forum. Just to really look at strong recommendations of investment in very good early warning system for especially smaller estates. And maybe start with very simple technologies that can mobilize very quickly to help this information go down to the communities. When there's a disaster happening, you need 5 or 10 districts, they move within an hour. There is about 5-hour displacement immediately. Over time, I think there's some models around from Japan and it's that are able to focus on two models to move with this data, elements data, weather data, information, can help inform these decisions.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're actually now hitting the limits of our time today. But I'm going to challenge you all to imagine that we're going to have some kind of a global platform with DRR bulletin going out tomorrow. And there are going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 headlines on the front page. What will yours be? Quick fire. Tiziana.
So my key point would be that we need to build capacity and awareness of loss and damage, and bring the local perspective and experience to inform countries that are currently carrying out loss and damage in these assessments, recognizing that this is not yet a common practice, but it would become one, especially when the climate finance discussions is going to really tackle the loss and damage angle.
Thanks,
So
Tiziana. As your editor, I have to stop you.
Yes.
Who's next?
Local perspective.
Global solidarity is key to
our discussions today by quoting a passage from Latin. To say that I feel the only thing you can do about life is to preserve it. By art, if you are an artist, by children, if you are not. So I think the importance of our life and how to preserve is our main agenda for today, and how to build that passage to the future.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Harjeet.
I would like to see humanitarian DRR community talking of human rights and saying polluters must pay for addressing loss and damage.
Thank you, Harjeet.
30% of, I mean, when we invest money into the early system, we will save 30% of potential loss and damage. So I think that's a powerful number to help the best
in
early warning system, especially.
We've got that loud and clear. Thank you, Permanent Secretary. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the wrap up. Thank you so much to all the organisers, everyone who supported and participated today in this event. Please go forth, take some of these messages you've been hearing into the other events across the rest of the week. Thank you for joining us. Good night. As you're leaving, I'll just mention there are some other events going on addressing the topic of displacement. On Thursday at 2:15, in Pick Up to Hold, there's a thematic session 6 on data governance and displacement risk. There's an innovation hub downstairs with exhibitions and interactions with artists and an exhibit on UNDR words into action guidelines on the topic. That's all. Thank you.